Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Susan Barber, and Mr. Escobar and I are excited to be back with you today as we are going to look at some of the elements about contrast, specifically in poetry. Like I said, I'm Susan Barber. I am from Atlanta, Georgia, and I teach at Grady High School. And my co-teacher, he's back with us today, like he will be every day. And we were just really excited yesterday to hear from so many teachers who said this is exactly what we've been working on in our classroom and it's good review. And that's just our hope the whole time, that we're just going to be able to come along and just reinforce things that your teachers have already been talking to you about in your classroom. Now, about a week from now, sometime at the end of next week, there will be a calendar that comes out, and this calendar will have the remaining lessons through May 1st. So at that point, you and your teachers will be able to choose the lessons that you will most benefit you in your review.
And I'm Mr. Escobar from Miami, Florida, from Felix Varela Senior High School. Excited to be back with you. I really do feel like we're all part of this learning community now. I received a lot of emails and a lot of positive feedback about what we're doing, and I'm just thrilled. And a special shout out to all my students who tuned in yesterday, and I'm sure they're tuning in today as well. We discussed yesterday how we're going to focus primarily on the latter part of the unit or of the course during these first 3 days, especially, and then we're going to talk about reviewing for the course as a whole and those special topics that are going to be covered on the AP exam. But today's going to give you a good idea as to what we mean by that once we get into the lesson overview. But rest assured that everything we're talking about are skills and ideas and notions that can help you become better readers and ultimately better writers in preparation for the AP exam. As a reminder, these are notions and skills that colleges and universities want us to cover so that they are sure that when you enter their campuses and you receive college credit for these coursework, that they know that you have covered all of the material so that they feel confident in awarding you the credit that you seek.
So we're going to be starting each session looking at the practice that you did the night before. We'll get into this routine. And even if you did not join the prior lesson, you can still jump in and we'll have some teaching points throughout even the warm-up section. So looking at last night's passage. So we looked at a prompt from the 2014 AP Lit exam, and it was the sonnet for That He Looked Not Upon Her. So at this point, Mr. Escobar and I are going to read this to you, then we'll jump into it and talk about some of the different claims and structural elements of this sonnet. And let me just pause and say now, like, we started with sonnets because they're the most structured, but we are going to be looking at more modern and some different voices, and are really excited to for tomorrow's lesson. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but starting with the most structured now, that's why we chose to start with the sonnets. So I'll start reading, and then Mr. Escobar. And notice the way we read, we're grouping the sonnet. We're going to be chunking the sonnet like we talked about yesterday. For he that looked not upon her. You must not wonder, though you think it strange, to see me hold my luring head so low, and that mine eyes take no delight to range, and the gleams which on your face do grow.
The mouse, which once hath broken out of trap, is seldom ticed with the trustless bait, but lies aloof for fear of more mishap, and feedeth still in doubt of deep deceit.
The scorched fly, which once has escaped the flame, will hardly come to play again with fire. whereby I learn that grievous is the game, which follows fancy dazzled by desire.
So that I wink or else hold down my head, because your blazing eyes my bale have bred.
So you'll notice that when we read that poem, it's still a sonnet, but the structure is a little different than yesterday's, where you have the octave and the sestet. This structure is different, and that's because this is what we call a Shakespearean or an English sonnet. This is a sonnet that Shakespeare most often used when he wrote. Still 14 lines, we still have that constraint, still a set rhyme scheme, but a little different than the one we looked at yesterday. So when we think about these Shakespearean sonnets, you're going to see that they are divided into 3 quatrains, or 3 groups of 4 lines, and the rhyme scheme is going to hold tight in those 4 lines. A, B, A, B. And then we go to another quatrain, C, D, C, D, another quatrain, E, F, E, F, and then the heroic or rhyming couplet at the end, G, G. So, and Mr. Escobar is going to talk about this in a minute, but we see the shift in this Shakespearean sonnet a lot of times happening at the very end. We still have a shift, it's just in a little different space. So when you're thinking about sonnets, and I'm sure you noticed this last night, I'm sure you've talked about this in class already. When you're thinking about the structure of the sonnet, think about, is it divided into octave, sestet, or maybe it's divided into quatrains? Whichever way it's divided, how can I use that structure to group ideas or words together? And then how does that grouping reinforce a controlling idea in the poem?
And we understand that we have hopefully a live audience today, and many of you will also pick up and watch these videos at your leisure later on. So let's go back a little bit and let's remind you of what we were talking about yesterday, because the warm-up each day will focus on the previous day's lesson. Yesterday we were talking about poetic structure, and we were looking at how poems are built and how these building blocks sometimes help us chunk the text. And by chunking the text, we're able to take a more friendly approach to the reading of a poem. Yesterday, we focused on the Petrarchan sonnet. And the red line there shows you the divide between the octave and the sestet. And for most Petrarchan sonnets, that's a pretty hard line. I mean, they usually do stick to this format, right? So you're able to quite confidently take the first 8 lines and then take the next 6 lines and try to make sense of those 2 separate parts, but obviously then piece them all together and see how they play off of each other. For Shakespeare, we have this quatrain, quatrain, quatrain divide. Shakespeare plays around with that. Shakespeare and everyone who's following in Shakespeare's footsteps by using this form, sometimes all 12 lines are really talking about one thing and there's no divide. Sometimes there's an octet, or the first 8 lines are grouped together about, centered on one subject, and then there's a quatrain. Sometimes it does follow this very specific format, which is the quatrain, quatrain, and quatrain. What's important to note here is, whereas with Petrarch, as soon as the rhyme switches, there is a volta. With Shakespeare, we have to determine if the content of the poem is running parallel to what's happening with the rhyme. However, what we can always count on is where that red line is, which is between lines 12 and 13, we're going to be prepared for the heroic couplet. Heroic couplet is just a set of 2 rhymed lines that happen to be written in iambic pentameter. But for our purposes today, let's just think of them as the 2 lines at the end that happen to rhyme with each other. And they normally do what the sestet in a Petrarchan sonnet will do, which is it'll provide some sort of conclusion or resolution, or sometimes, and this is a great little tip for perhaps the examination, sometimes it's just a summary of what the first 12 lines were about. So if you're having problems reading those 12 lines, maybe you'll focus on the heroic couplet, finally understand what the sonnet is about, and then you can go back and do a quick reading of the poem and try to master what Shakespeare or his followers are doing within the form. Here we go to the poem that we already read, and we can see that it is 14 lines. And when we look at the rhyme scheme, we have A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So we definitely have a Shakespearean sonnet. We didn't mark up the quatrain separations because that doesn't always work out. Now, in this one, it does, and Ms. Barber's going to talk to you about those divisions, but we did go ahead and put that line between the 12th and 13th lines because we want to make sure that we focus on that heroic couplet. But this is a quick visual to determine, am I talking about Petrarch or am I talking about Shakespeare here? It happens to be Shakespearean, so I'm not going to focus so much on the 8th, 9th line. I'm going to look to see if the quatrains form clusters, and then I'm going to focus on that heroic couplet at the end. And here we see an easier way, I think, to visualize the possible divisions within the poem.
Yeah, so we can look at the, if you'll go back 1 second to, perfect. So when we look at this, before we jump into the possible claims, you will see that each quatrain has like a central thought or subtopic, sub-idea that supports the overall theme. The first quatrain is going to be talking, it's about the speaker and how the speaker is feeling, holding his head down, looking down. Then we have this, the second quatrain is about a mouse that has been once trapped. And the third is about a fly that has escaped death. And then the couplet at the end goes back to the speaker. So each quatrain is going to have one idea that it kind of fleshes out. So let's look now at some claims, some possible claims that you may have written last night when we were thinking about it. And this is just what I was saying. Each quatrain is bound by a rhyme scheme that encloses or expands upon an idea or image that speaks to distrust. And so we have, like I just said, and you were able to see the visual of that last time. That's an idea of how structure can reinforce a controlling idea, a central idea in a poem. Or maybe we want to talk about specifically about the structure and the rhyme scheme, and we want to look at some specific words that rhyme and how do these rhyming words point us to a central idea. We see bait and deceit. Well, those are really interesting words to pair together. Fire and desire. Again, this whole poem is about him desiring to look, but not wanting to look because he can be burned. So these two words really get to the heart of what this poem is about. And these are all avenues in for you to explore, to expand upon. There are ways for you to get into the text and think about it more analytically. It also, I love when students are able to zero in on specific words and phrases, because that lets you be very concise and focused in your analysis. A lot of times, especially when we're writing and writing quickly, we tend to be very broad-based in our analysis. So if you can take it down to these word levels, and unpacking rhyming words is perfect for that. If you can take it down to the word level and start thinking and analyzing each word and how that ties back to a specific theme, then you're really set for some in-depth analysis.
Absolutely. And we are going to transition now from yesterday's lesson, which was on poetic structure, to today's lesson, which will focus on contrast. Now, we're not talking about contrast as perhaps you've heard of it before in terms of compare and contrast necessarily. We're going to talk about contrast as an umbrella term. And we're going to, again, talk about terminology, make sure we're using the same terminology, because across different classrooms, different words might be used for the same idea. So again, contrast we're going to use as an umbrella term for very specific notions, but the focus of it will be the function of these contrasts within a text. We want to ultimately use these contrasts that we're going to be talking about to explore the complexities, because if we're able to read with an eye on the complexities of the text, then our interpretations will in turn be just as complex. And that's the ultimate goal. So what do we mean by contrast? I'm gonna take a moment here to discuss what we meant in the introduction also about what happens at the end of the course versus what we've been doing for the first 3/4 of the course. Today, we're specifically going to look at contrast in terms of situational irony and paradox, because according to the framework that has been built for this course, at the end of our courses, this is what we should be focusing on. However, for the first 3/4 of this course, we should have looked at other forms of contrast. And those forms of contrast are contrasting tones or point of view, character, narrator, or speaker's perspective and how they may contrast, contrasting settings, and contrasting imagery. Because today we're talking about situational irony and paradox within the umbrella of contrast, that does not mean that you don't bring into your interpretation and into your analysis, and if we were having a conversation right now, into our discussion, all of those contrasting elements that you've already covered in class. So again, we're hoping that you've already covered the items on the left side of the screen, and today we're going to focus on the items on the right side of the screen. Having said that, for the exam, we've already been told that it's going to be a free response question this year. The beauty of that is that you're not limited by whatever's on that multiple choice STEM or the options. Everything that you're able to place on your tool belt, you're going to bring with you on the day of the exam in order to attack that passage and answer that prompt. So just because tone, point of view, so on and so forth are in the left part of the screen, that doesn't mean that if you see a paradox, you're absolutely going to write about that paradox on the AP exam. Okay.
And we just want to give you a couple of more tools today to put in your toolbox, ways that you can think about complexities in a text. So we are going to jump in today's lesson and look at irony and paradox. So to start, I want us to look at this photo. This is called Marriage a la Mode, and this is in a series of art pieces. And this is the first one. It's called The Marriage Settlement. This picture in the 1700s, it's kind of poking fun at satire and really trying to push people's ideas on marriage and the traditional idea of marriage in that time period. So I really like this photo because it has a lot of ironies in it. And just like we're going to look at some text with ironies, we can look at this and see ironies. And so as we start looking at this picture, just a few things come to mind. We see the bride and the groom. So the groom over here in the blue and the bride sitting next to them. Again, we think about, a bride and a groom. Well, they are not looking at each other. They're looking in different directions. And that makes us looking at this piece go, that's interesting. I'd like to think on that a little more, because that doesn't seem to line up like how a bride and groom should be. They should be facing each other and smiling at each other, but they're looking in different directions. That's really interesting. Then if you look at the groom on the left side, you see he's looking at himself in the mirror. Again, just something that makes us wonder and think that doesn't really align to what we would think a couple approaching marriage. He should be not looking at himself, but he should be absorbed in her. Several ironies in this. My favorite at the bottom, and you may want to spend some more time looking at this, talking with your teacher about it. I love in the bottom left-hand corner, we have this picture of two dogs and they are chained together. Well, isn't that a really interesting image to include in a picture? about marriage. I just think that's what is the painter trying to communicate here. And we see like there's, these people over here working on a contract, negotiating a contract. Again, so the emphasis is not on love, but the emphasis is on the business side of things. So just like we can look at art, you can look at music, you can look at videos and see all kind of ironies and things that just seem to not make sense. We see that in text too. And we want to train our eyes to look for things that don't necessarily align or that make us think, that doesn't seem to support the idea that the person is talking about. Why is that? What can I learn from this? How does that take me deeper into the text? So let's look at today's text. And we are going to look, go ahead.
Yeah, so the poem we're looking at is Sir Philip Sidney's Thou Blind Man's Mark. And we are going to analyze the structure of it. We don't want to let go of yesterday's lesson, right? As we delve into today's lesson, which is on contrast, we want to show you how different components of this course are intertwined. And you can't really just say, well, that was yesterday's topic and today's topic is about something else. No, we want to make sure that you come along with us on this ride, and everything we're teaching and everything you're learning or reviewing, you're able to apply each day. So let's take a look at this poem. Thou blind man's mark, thou fool self-chosen snare, fond fancy scum and dregs of scattered thought, band of all evils, cradle of causeless care, thou web of will, whose end is never wrought. Desire, desire I have too dearly bought, with price of mangled mind thy worthless ware. Too long asleep thou hast me brought, who should my mind to higher things prepare.
But yet in vain thou hast my ruin sought. In vain thou madest me to vain things aspire. In vain thou kindlest all thy smoky fire. For virtue hath this better lesson taught, within myself to seek my only higher, desiring not, but how to kill desire.
Well, I think the picture you showed us earlier pretty much killed desire, right?
So we're going to look at a couple of examples of irony, and then we're going to look at an example of paradox. And then we are going to, most importantly, think about how these connect back to the central idea of a poem. So we see, before we even jump into that, we notice the structure of this sonnet, again, is slightly different. So we started with very structured yesterday. Now we're starting to break that structure a little, but it still has structural elements that give you clues. So we have the A, B, A, B. Now we can also, like we talked about yesterday, use our punctuation. We have a period there. So that kind of ends that thought. And then we're going to have the rhyme scheme B, A, B, A, and that's going to be the octave. And again, we have a period. And even though we start with a B again, instead of switching to C right here, we can look at the beginning of line 9 and see but and yet. So we know this shift, this volta, it is still happening here. We are still shifting between the octave and the sestet. So use your clues that you know. So even if all elements of structure don't align, you can still see the transition. You can still see the end mark with the period and let that guide you in that there is a shift. And then we have structure. It's a little different, but we have the structural elements in the sestet, and the rhyme scheme switches to a BCC, BCC. So again, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I want to touch upon here is sometimes in our own classrooms, we try to create these structures for students in the things that we teach, right? This is a sonnet, this is a villanelle, this is a limerick. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of these poems, it's sort of like music. I'm going to show my ignorance here. I don't know where hip hop ends and R&B begins, or what's modern and what's contemporary in music. And I watch the Grammys and I look at all these categories. It's all music to me, right? I mean, I could tell the difference between a symphony and a rap song, but once you get into the minutia of the categories, it seems, as a non-expert here, that a lot of these musical influences blend, right? These artists know each other, they listen to each other. So when you create these demarcations for poetry, it's sort of the same thing. We want to have these clusters of information. It helps us to learn. But here with Sydney's poem, you see really how different schools of poetry, different conventions bleed into one another. These poets are learning from each other. They're challenging each other. They're trying to outdo each other, right? Sort of like a rap battle is what the world of poetry was and perhaps still is, right? And here we see Sidney definitely want to begin with that Shakespearean rhyme scheme, but he does place that but in the ninth line. So that's a very Petrarchan move. And I don't want students to be confused by this. I want you to understand, like Ms. Barber was saying, there are conventions that are solid and they're definitely following a school of form. And then there's others that are just trying to find their own way into making sonnets fresh and their own. And this is the case here with Sir Philip Sidney, I think.
So let's start looking in the first line. We're going to unpack a couple of these examples of irony and just think about how they can add depth and expand the meaning of poems. Anytime we're given an image to think about, it's to help us rethink a concept in a different way. So that might open up a different way that we view it. And so we want to think in depth about each one of these. So let's look at the first one, thou blind man's mark. And here's some questions just to think about. So you'll have these, whether you're thinking about imagery, whether you're thinking about figurative language. Today, we're thinking about situational irony. We want to ask ourselves some questions. Remember, it's important to question and to self-question when we're reading. So here's some questions we can think about when we're thinking about this phrase, thou blind man's mark. How can a blind man possibly hit a target? I mean, there's some irony there. So why is Sidney pointing us to this? What might he be saying through that? If you think about a blind man with a bow and arrow trying to hit a target, I mean, that's ridiculous. Like that just does not make sense. Also important, this is the opening image that he gives us. So is he wanting to say this is absurd, or this almost cannot happen? Why does he open with this image? And how might this add to the meaning of the poem? And again, we've just looked at it as the first line, but when we start thinking about this in the context of the poem, one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is, how does this add to the meaning? And he talks about desire and him trying to conquer desire. And so when we think about this image, this piece of irony adding to the meaning, it's almost like a blind man, a person who can't see, trying to shoot an arrow, trying to hit a mark. It's just very difficult to do. So he opens with that, and then in the very same line, the first line, he gives us another example of situational irony. There, thou fool self-chosen snare. Who would make a trap for themselves? Like, who does that, you know? But yet that's the image that he follows up with. So why would a person choose or set their own trap? In what way? How does this connect to the first example that we're given? You know, both of these are just things that don't make sense. It seems like it's just an absurd way to approach life. And then how does this add to the meaning. It's almost like the speaker is recognizing, oh, I'm almost setting myself up for something. So that's how it opens. And now we want to carry these ideas and think about these as we read throughout the poem.
And let's remember that today we're talking about contrast, right? Two specific contrasts. The first contrast is the situational irony, which Ms. Barber was talking about. And the second one is the idea of paradox. And perhaps we should stop here and define what a paradox is, and let's have a common understanding of what we're talking about. The way that I normally explain paradox is I tell them the story of Ursula in 100 Years of Solitude. So in this novel, it's a very long novel, you have this matriarch who, you know, struggles throughout the novel to make sure that her children are happy and protected and her house is taken care of and the family unit is maintained despite all kinds of craziness that's going on out there. And she, throughout her life, she thinks she knows her kids, she thinks she knows her family, but it isn't until the very end. Once, now listen carefully, once Ursula goes blind, that she begins to see her children for who they truly are. So think about that notion of when you can see, you are blind to the truth, but once Ursula goes blind, suddenly she's able to see. A paradox is when you have two items that would logically seem to be impossible, but when brought together and brought together as a statement of truth, then you have a paradox. Here you have a woman who is blind who suddenly sees. So that's my working definition. That's how I usually think about paradox. So if we look at the final line of this poem, desiring not but how to kill desire, you know, throughout this sonnet you have this lamentation, right, from the speaker, this man will say, right, although we separate speaker from the poet, but I think we might be more guilty of this kind of melodrama, right? But the speaker is saying, oh, the desire has brought me so much pain, I refuse to desire her any longer. Well, guess what, buddy? You're writing a poem, or you're speaking these thoughts about how you still love her, or you know, how you refuse to love her. Clearly, you still desire her because she's still running through your mind. Now, notice the words here: desiring nothing, but how to kill desire. Well, if you want to kill desire and that's your only desire, you still have desire. So that's where the paradox comes in with this final line of the poem. What does the speaker desire? Well, we know what the speaker desires his beloved, and he desires to kill desire, or does he? Right? Perhaps that's the irony. He doesn't really want that. He would like to maybe satisfy his desire, have her love him, and then he can stop writing the sonnet and go and marry her, right? Um, and we spoke about the irony here. And how does this add to the meaning? Well, Ms. Barber talked about how the central idea, the central force of this poem is the notion of desire. So his inability to stop desiring, whether it's his beloved or the desire to kill desire, clearly tells you that he's stuck in this this world of wanting and yearning for something.
So now we want to do a quick check for understanding. And what we're going to do during this time is just think about, we've identified some examples of irony, we've identified paradox, but the bigger idea is, how does this tie into a central idea or your interpretation of the poem? So let's put this poem up again.
And let's remind you also that even though we're focusing on situational irony and paradox, this might be a good moment for some of you to, again, take a screenshot of this if you're watching us live, or if you're watching after the fact, then perhaps pause it here. And we're talking about situational irony and paradox, but you've already looked at contrast throughout the course, because you've already looked at things such as tone, point of view, character settings, and imagery. How do those elements, contrasting elements, appear in this poem, and how do they contribute to the meaning? So that's for you to do, and that's definitely for you to consider for each poem that you encounter. But for today's lesson, we're going to look specifically at the top two.
At situational irony and paradox, even though there's tons and tons of imagery in here. And next week, as we shift to some more broader topics, we will look in broader context. But for today's lesson, go ahead. We're going to give you about, we've looked at this poem for a few minutes now, so we'll give you 30 to 45 seconds. But I want you to be thinking about 2 or 3 different ways that specifically the irony we looked at and the paradox add to the meaning of this poem.
And it might be helpful if we do this so that you guys can see where some of the irony is and where some of the paradox is. So this is the moment where you take the evidence, and we're going to have videos on evidence and commentary later on, but we're providing you the evidence. We want to know what's the commentary and what's the claim that you're going to make, right? How do these two sections, how do these two lines of the poem connect to the meaning and the idea of desire here?
Okay, so let's talk about a couple. And yours may be like this. Yours may be something else. These are just examples. So you could definitely, these are not the right answers. These are a couple of suggestions, and you could certainly have other ideas that we don't mention. So a couple of suggestions that came to our mind are the opening examples of irony in Thou Blind Man's Mark. It opens the poem immediately and highlights the speaker's feelings of helplessness when confronting desire. Now, if you were going to write about this, you could go in depth to specific words in these phrases, how they're ironic, why it shows one thing and what that means, and then you could connect it back to the central idea. And in future lessons, we will talk more in depth about writing, but right now we're just wanting to think about general ways that it adds to the structure. Another idea, ultimately the paradox in the final line confirms that despite the speaker's assertions, he has not been able to stop desiring his beloved. So that highlights that paradox, and it ties it, it connects it back to this central idea of the poem. So again, you may have more suggestions, and those are good things for you and your class and your teacher to talk about.
Absolutely. And what we've done for each of these lessons is we want to have a moment where we talk about what happens next. What happens next time that you encounter a text based on the concepts, the terminology, and the processes that we talked about today. And what we want to leave you with each day is a series of questions that you could ask yourself. And again, we want you to take these questions and make them your own. So if you're jotting things down, if you're taking notes, don't just copy it down, but put it in your own words so they can truly be useful questions for next time you encounter text. I want to draw your attention specifically to the first and last two bullets here. The first one asks, what are some striking contrasts in a text? That's a very rudimentary step, I think. And that's where we have to begin. You have a text. You're going to ask yourself, what are the contrasts here? Maybe jot down the different forms of contrasts that we already covered. And then when you make your annotations, a lot of times students say, I don't know what to highlight, so I don't highlight anything, or everything seems important, so I highlight the whole thing. Well, a good tip is whenever you highlight something, make sure you write something. Marginal note taking is key, because then you know why you highlighted it. So if you find a contrast, highlight it, and then in the margins write what kind of contrast it is, and then that'll help you make the connection later on to meaning. And if we look at the last two questions, how does a contrast contribute to complexity in text? And how does a contrast contribute to meaning in a text? And I want us to take those two as a unit. because it is only when we're able to delve into the complexities of the text that we're going to go beyond the superficial reading of anything that we encounter. And then our meaning or our interpretation for plausible meanings of the text will reach the level of complexity that you're all striving for in order to receive college credit, in order to learn, in order to show your teachers that you have certainly gathered knowledge and skills from the courses. So these questions, I believe, are critical to a reader being more proficient in their analysis of literature.
So for tonight's practice, this is the poem that we would like for you to look at. It's called Convergence of the Twain, and this has been a prior AP prompt before. Now, here we are moving away from the sonnet. This is in the 2002 exam. So this is it is not a sonnet, but you will still see that this poem is divided into different stanzas, and it definitely has a structure. So use your knowledge of what we've already been talking about with structure. And even though it's not the strict confines of a sonnet, we still want to be thinking about structure. But tonight we're going to work specifically or look specifically at contrast and think about that. What contrast can you identify in this poem from the 2002 exam, and how do they add to the meaning of the poem? And that's how we are going to open tomorrow's lesson. We will talk about this for a few minutes, and then we are so excited because we have been talking to a living poet. We are going to be using her poem tomorrow, and excited to, we've looked at some older works, and tomorrow we're going to be looking at some very contemporary poetry. So, and this will be our bridge in between the two. So again, we hope that this is helpful and comes alongside and just reinforces things that you're already learning in the classroom. And also hopefully this will be just a good way for you and your teachers to talk further, because honestly, these, a lot of these lessons can be 1 or 2 class periods.
Absolutely. And let's also, since we talk about community building here, we know that there's a lot of people who are trying to reach the videos or would like to be able to connect with the lessons that we're sharing here. And we know that some of our friends out there don't have internet access or devices, and this is a real concern, and we're very sensitive to this. And this is where we can all chip in and help out. There's a site here that we would like for you to write into and connect with. If you know that there's someone out there who needs these resources, and obviously they couldn't do it themselves if they don't have the device or the access, but let's connect with our friends and let's figure out who out there needs devices. What we keep seeing in the news out there is that we need to have social distance, but that doesn't mean that we're not making connections. Like I told you on yesterday's video, I don't have any social media, so I don't listen to the good or the bad that's out there, but I definitely received tons of very warm emails, and I appreciate all of those. And many came from my students, and I miss them dearly. But I want to reiterate that what Ms. Barber and I are bringing to you is not the be all and end all of how this course is taught, but it's a resource to supplement or to give you a different view into what your teachers have been doing with you the entire year. I asked you yesterday, I have no way of knowing if you did the homework assignment, but I asked you to take the time to write to your teachers and thank them for what they've done to you. And I think it's important that we all connect in that way as well.
So we are looking forward to seeing each of you tomorrow. We'll dive into some modern poetry. And until then, have a great rest of the day.
we may have a fan or two out there, so we can continue. I think we may have a little extra time.
So my dog gave up on us. He moved over to his bed. He's like, enough talking poetry. Had enough.
You know, I'm glad that you did mention to our listeners out there about tomorrow's poem. I'm very excited, and you know, a lot of times.
I'm sure most
Okay,
kids just
good.
logged out as soon as.
Yeah.
We weren't disconnecting, so we had to keep going.
No worries. I know it's hard to kind of sit there and just say,